In this video, we're going to take a look at the process involved in getting an instance of Graphene API Gateway up and running on a local developer environment. Now, the instructions that we're about to follow are going to be very similar for a server environment, but for the time being, we're just going to get this up and running on a local Macintosh local development environment. So you'll notice here that I'm at github.com/escherlabs/GrapheneAPIGateway, and I can go ahead and I can copy the URL to the repository. So I go ahead and press copy here, and I'm just going to bring up a terminal window over here, and you'll notice that I'm actually in a directory here called projects where we're going to check out that code. So I'm going to do git clone and paste in the URL right here. So that just brought down all of the code for the Graphene API Gateway server. And what I can do next is I can cd into that directory, but for the sake of convenience, I'm going to actually open up that whole directory in Visual Studio Code over here. So let's open up the current directory, and I'm going to take Graphene API Gateway, and I'm going to drag that onto Visual Studio Code. So now we're actually in the Graphene API Gateway directory, or we're looking at it in a text editor here, and we've got a terminal window open inside of that directory. So the next thing I need to do is I need to run this command called composer install. Now, Composer is a package manager that we have for PHP, which will allow us to install dependencies. I happen to have Composer already installed on my machine, but if you don't have Composer, you're going to go ahead and need to go to getcomposer.org, and you can download Composer and get that installed. Similarly, I already have PHP installed as well. I'm actually running PHP version 7.2, but for at least the current version of Graphene API Gateway, PHP 7.1 or later should be fine. I also have MySQL installed as well. So we have a PHP, MySQL, and Composer. So having all of that, I'm going to go ahead and say Composer install. And that's going to pull down all of the dependencies and all of the tools that we need to get Graphene API Gateway up and running. The next thing that we do, once that's run successfully, is we're going to run PHP artisan install. And that's going to walk us through the installation script to get our environment set up. So let's go ahead and do that. And what this tells me is that the database connection for the Graphene API Gateway server is not working correctly. And that makes sense because we haven't set that up yet. You'll notice that these are all blank here. So it says unable to connect to the database. Do you want to configure the database now? I'm going to say yes. And for the rest of these, I'm going to say mostly the defaults. So the MySQL server name here will do 127.0.0.1. Obviously, if you were running this on a different server, you might want to specify that instead. Port 3306. The name of the database, I'm just going to say Graphene API Gateway. And the username, I'll just say Graphene and Graphene. Okay, so that's all been done. Now, if I didn't have this database already set up on my local machine, it gives me the commands here that I could actually run these things, and I could go in here and I could set all this stuff up. But I've actually already set that up here. So if I go to my connections here, I have one for Graphene API Gateway, and I've already set up the server over here. So I'm just going to go ahead and connect to it. You'll notice that there's no tables here at the time being yet, though, because we haven't actually built those out. So what I do need to do, though, is I need to copy this information right here, and I need to create a new file within the Graphene API Gateway directory called .env, and I'm going to paste all that information right into here. And once I've done with that, I'm going to rerun this PHP artisan install script. So let's go ahead and do that. This time, obviously, we see the database has been set up, which is great. It's actually able to connect to the database, and it's able to run the migrations. So if we go back to the database over here and we refresh, we'll see that we have all of our tables here because the migrations came in successfully. It also is creating an app key for me. It was able to generate that on the fly. It's asking me if we want to turn on app debug. And since we're running this in a development environment, we're going to go ahead and say yes. And it's also telling me that I need a username for this API Gateway account. This is like the master username. So I'm just going to say Graphene. Okay, so I'm going to copy all of this information right here, and we're going to paste that up into the same environment file here. And once we've done that, we're going to rerun this PHP artisan install script. And okay, so we're connected to the database. Everything looks good, and we're now all set up and running. So that's great. That's all we have to do for Graphene API Gateway server. Now, If you're running this in a production environment, you probably want to use something like Nginx or Apache to get this all served up. But since we're not running this in a production environment, we're running this in a development environment, I'm just going to use the built-in PHP web server here using the following command, and I'm going to serve it up that way. The T here says that we're serving up the public directory, which is this guy right here. And we also have, let's see, the URL, which is GrapheneAPIGateway dev.local, and then we're listening on port 8001. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and we'll open that up in a web browser. And you'll notice here that it says welcome. So we're all set. Now, one of the first things we can do is we can connect to it, and we'll issue a get command to look at what the environments are. And of course, when I try to do that, it comes back and says I need a username and password. Well, I have my username and password over here. We actually created those in the previous step. So the username is Graphene, and the password was auto-generated here. Go ahead and press save. Okay, and it's coming back and it's saying that we have no environment set up yet. And that makes sense because in the database here, you'll notice that we have no environments. So we could actually issue some post commands using something like Postman or just raw with curl to create an environment. But much easier than that, we can actually use an instance of Graphene to configure the Graphene API Gateway, and that'll give us a whole nice interface for doing those kinds of things. So I've got a local instance of Graphene up and running right here, and I'm going to go into the admin panel, and I'm going to click on Sites and go into the one site that I have set up. And then I'm going to click on API Gateway Config. Now I actually have this stuff already built out for the most part here, where I have API Gateway Local. Local is in the slug here. This is a server that we're listening to. And notice it's important that we actually specify whether or not we're using HTTP or HTTPS for that particular server. The password which we had, which I'll have to update here. So let's grab that password, put that in there. And the username, which of course is Graphene. So we'll go ahead and save that. And now I can click again under my name, click on API Gateway Local, and this should load all of the environments that we had set up for that particular instance, which it does. And of course, there's nothing here. So the last thing we're going to do before we end this video is we're going to build a new environment. So we're going to call this one local, local dev, and let's put the domain in here. Oops, let's see, where's our domain? It's going to be this guy right here. There we go. Oops. And this is going to be a development environment, so that looks about right. So we'll go ahead and press save, and we'll just say initial version. All right. Oops. I'm not sure if I saved that or not. If I clicked out of the box, if that worked correctly, we should have a little message up here in the corner, which I'm not seeing at the moment. So let's go ahead and do that again. All right. So let's try that again. We'll do local dev. And we'll paste this URL into here. And it's a dev environment. So we'll go ahead and press save and say initial version. Okay, press save again. And in a second here, this should come up saying that it did actually create that version. So there we go, successfully added. And now if we go back to this URL here, which showed our version list, which was empty before, we should be able to refresh. And it says that we've actually got this Graphene API Gateway dev.local. And similarly, if we go directly into our database, we can see that this is right here. So that's really the last thing we're going to do before as part of this video. Thanks.